Oh, yes, it is. Oh, yes.
Beautiful. Good evening. I'm Stanley Heller, chairperson of the Middle East Crisis Committee and host of the Struggle TV News. And I'd like to welcome you to this event. The event is co-sponsored by the Yale Council on Middle East Studies, the Arab Student Association, El Auda, Connecticut, and the Connecticut chapter of the Palestine American Congress. Norman Finkelstein pulls no punches. He's direct, unsparing, and challenging. He categorized Joan Peters' very highly praised book From Time Immemorial as a hoax. He called the demands some Jewish organizations put on Swiss banks as a shakedown. And he describes a recent book by the most senior member of the Harvard Law School faculty as a fraud. But he backs up his provocative charges with evidence. He reads the footnotes meticulously and then goes back and reads the sources. And then he produces solid works of critical scholarship in books like A Nation on Trial, the Goldhagen Thesis, The Holocaust Industry, and his most recent work, Beyond Chutzpah, The Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History. Finkelstein specializes in debunking mythology, fabrications that glorify decades of colonialization, occupation, and apartheid. Norman Finkelstein has taught political science at New York University and Hunter College and currently teaches political theory at DePaul University. Please welcome Norman Finkelstein.
Let's just get the sound right. Can you hear me in the back? You okay? Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And that was a short introduction, which I am grateful for, because I'm going to be speaking for a fairly long period of time. I want to try to cover as much ground as I can this evening and also allow for the questions and answers and for us to have an exchange of opinions. I want to begin, before I get to the heart of my discussion, I want to begin by discussing two recent events, both of which most of you will be familiar with, and use those events as a point of departure for looking at the heart or the core of my talk this evening. In July 2004, the International Court of Justice delivered a milestone verdict on the wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories. As it happened, the verdict the advisory opinion, didn't deal only with the question of the legality of the wall, but it touched on a large number of kindred topics, which in many respects cut to the core of the Israel-Palestine conflict. For example, the High Court decision explicitly reported or recalled that the territory Israel occupied after June 1967, for our purposes, the West Bank and Gaza, that those territories are occupied territory. That is to say, under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. The International Court of Justice pointed both to the UN Resolution 242 as well as the General Assembly Resolution of 1970, as well as Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, and said, under international law, acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible. Israel has no title to a square inch of the West Bank, of Gaza, and they keep repeating, of East Jerusalem. Number two, well, that means, just to put it in plain terms, the West Bank and Gaza are not disputed territories, as we're often told nowadays. They are occupied territories. Number two, the World Court decision at several junctures recalled that all the settlements that Israel has built in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, all those settlements are illegal under international law. They recalled Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying country from transferring its population to occupied territory, as well as recalling several, I think it's 3 or 4, Security Council resolutions stating that Israel has no right under international law to build the settlements in the occupied territories. That means, simply, all 400,000 settlers have to leave, and all the settlements have to be dismantled. Number three, as I mentioned a moment ago, the International Court of Justice repeatedly included East Jerusalem as occupied territory. Its status is exactly the same as the West Bank and Gaza. And finally, as most of you know, the World Court ruled that or gave its advisory opinion, that the wall Israel is building in the occupied territories is illegal under international law. They have to dismantle it, provide compensation, and so forth. What's striking about the decision, the opinion, is not only how far-reaching it was. What's really striking about the decision is the unanimity with which it was reached. The vote was 14-1. Of the 15 judges, the 14 went along with everything I just described, and even the one dissenting judge, Thomas Bergenthal from the United States, even his dissent from the decision was a half-hearted dissent, because he begins by saying in his declaration that, in fact, I agree with a lot of what the World Court has decided. I won't go through everything he agreed on. There's one point, however, which merits recalling or underlining, and that is, he says at the end of his declaration, if the wall that's being built in the West Bank, if its purpose is to protect the settlements, then it's illegal under international law. Case closed. What's striking about that fact, and I won't have time to go into it right now, what's striking about that fact is, in the last High Court of Justice ruling, the Israeli High Court of Justice ruling, the ruling that dealt with the Israeli settlement of Alfai Menash, the Chief Justice of the Israeli Court, Mr. Barak, he's very emphatic in his second ruling. It was the second judgment of the High Court. He's very emphatic that we, meaning the State of Israel, are operating within the framework of international law. And he argues as well that everything we're doing is consistent with the World Court opinion. He says the only difference is we disagree on the facts, but we agree on the law. Now, that's a flat-out lie, because every member of the World Court, including the one dissent, Mr. Bergenthal, they all agreed that under international law, protecting the settlements is illegal. And Barak Chief Justice Barak is very straightforward in the second judgment, the Alfai Manash judgment, that they're building the wall to protect the settlement. And therefore, everyone on the World Court agrees, notwithstanding what Barak has stated, everyone agrees that wall is illegal. Incidentally, for those of you who are troubled by my usage, linguistic usage, the court, the International Court of Justice, even ruled on that question. It begins its advisory opinion by stating that some people call this structure a fence, some people call it a barrier, and some people call it a wall. We've examined all three terms, each of which has its shortcomings, but in the end we agree it's a wall. On everything, the opinion of the World Court is diametrically opposed to what Israel is doing and has been doing for the past 40 years. In fact, what's most striking is, and this will be, I will return to it in a moment, on all of these issues, inadmissibility of acquiring territory by war, the illegality of the settlements, the fact that East Jerusalem is occupied territory. On all of these issues, they are virtually unmentionable in the United States. In public life, you cannot say East Jerusalem is occupied territory. You cannot say the settlements are illegal. You cannot say the territories are occupied. If you look at the bylines in the newspaper, it used to say at one time West Bank, occupied territory. It no longer does. Now it's officially disputed territory, but not according to the World Court. It's occupied territory. Let me turn to a second example, one which is fresher perhaps in the minds of most of you, namely the events in Gaza. However you want to characterize them, I think everybody here would agree that the depiction in public life in the United States was that Prime Minister Sharon had made a major gesture towards peace, that he ended the occupation of Gaza, and now, as we were repeatedly told, the ball is in the court of the Palestinians to match the gesture of Prime Minister Sharon. That, I think, we can agree is a fair description of how the events in Gaza were depicted here. It's very striking, however, when you compare that depiction, the depiction of public life in the U.S., with what human rights organizations and other authoritative bodies had to say about the Gaza withdrawal. Let's begin with B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, which is the main Israeli human rights organization monitoring the West Bank and Gaza. In March of this year, B'Tselem issued a report on Gaza. It was a hefty report, about 150 pages, and it was entitled One Big Prison, and went on to describe in some detail what life is like in Gaza. At the end of the report, they looked into the question of the disengagement plan, which had just been ratified. And they said that under the disengagement plan, Israel still controls all the land borders, still controls all the water points of entry in the water, still controls the airspace, still controls all the movement of goods and people between Gaza and the rest of the world, still maintains the right to enter Gaza militarily at will, and they conclude at the end of their lengthy report that Israel's claim that the occupation of Gaza has ended. They use the word that's questionable. Human Rights Watch the main US-based international human rights organization, on August 19th, it issued a statement on the events in Gaza. And they stated categorically that, repeating again what B'Tselem had written, so long as these methods of control remain in Israeli hands, Israel's claim of an end of the occupation is questionable. Oh, no, that was B'Tselem. The Human Rights Watch concluded whether the Israeli army is inside Gaza or redeployed around its periphery and restricting entrance and exit, it remains in control. That is to say, notwithstanding the extravaganza of news coverage about the so-called Gaza disengagement, under international law, exactly zero, precisely zero, has changed. Gaza was and still is occupied territory, and Israel controls all movement. It's not a complicated idea. It's a fairly straightforward one. If jailers throw the keys to the prisoners, allowing the prisoners to free themselves from their cells, but then the jailers redeploy on the periphery of the prison and shut tight the gates, the prisoners are still in prison. Nothing has changed. And that's exactly what, under international law, happened in Gaza. The prisoners were freed from their cells, but the prison itself is still shut tight. Okay, that's at the legal level. How about at the practical level, the level of daily life? The world's leading authority on Gaza is, I think, unquestionably Sarah Roy of Harvard University. She's written the most substantial study on the Gaza Strip. And shortly after the so-called Israeli disengagement, she wrote an article, and she says that Gaza remains an imprisoned enclave. So far as its economy is concerned, she wrote that most likely the already catastrophic conditions in Gaza almost certainly are going to deteriorate. That was also the opinion of another very mainstream authoritative body, the World Bank, which wrote that if Israel seals Gaza's borders, the disengagement plan will, quote, create more hardship than is seen today. So at the legal level, nothing has changed. At the practical level, the greatest likelihood is things are going to get a lot worse. That's Gaza. What about the West Bank? The case of the West Bank, Israel is currently absorbing, according to the best figures we have, about 10% of the West Bank, including the most fertile land and the crucial water resources. The most authoritative report now on the West Bank, or on what I'll get to right now, Jerusalem, was put out by another very mainstream organization, the International Crisis Group. And the Crisis Group put out a report entitled The Jerusalem Powder Keg. What did it find? Before I turn to that, just a couple of basic figures. There are now more settlers who have entered the West Bank during this year, approximately 14,000 who have entered this year. There are now more settlers who have entered the West Bank than the settlers who were taken out of Gaza, approximately 8,500. In addition, Israel has now confiscated more land just in July. Just in July, it confiscated about 25 miles of land around Ma'ale Adunim. It confiscated more land than it withdrew from in Gaza, which was about 19 square miles. What does the Crisis Group report? It says the following. Number one, the wall that Israel is building is now on the verge of bisecting the West Bank into two. Number two, it's imprisoning about 200,000 Palestinians on one side of the wall, separating them from the West Bank. And it's separating about another 100,000 Arab Jerusalemites from their schools, their hospitals, and so forth inside Jerusalem. Number three, it's absorbing East Jerusalem, which means it's making impossible a Palestinian state. Because they say, to quote, use their metaphor, they said a Palestinian state without East Jerusalem is like a chassis without an engine. It's inconceivable, they write, that you can have a Palestinian state without East Jerusalem as its capital, and yet that's exactly what's happening now. How do they conclude? They say as follows. Let me just get their concluding remarks. They say that although Prime Minister Sharon has been giving lip service to a two-state settlement, the actions of the Israeli government are at war with any viable two-state solution and will not bolster Israel's security. In fact, they will undermine it, weakening Palestinian pragmatists and sowing the seeds of growing radicalization. I begin with those two examples with a purpose in mind, and they're to illustrate the huge chasm, the unbridgeable chasm, that exists among mainstream scholars, authoritative bodies, legal bodies, an unbridgeable chasm that exists between those who are knowledgeable on the topic, those who are respected in the topic, and those who have authority on the topic, where among them there exists a consensus. There is no controversy. That's what's so striking. The World Court decision, 14-1, with even barely that one, a dissent. On Gaza, every human rights organization wrote the same thing. Every responsible, authoritative economic body wrote the same thing. And so you have this very peculiar phenomenon. You have a consensus among all respected bodies on what's going on in the occupied territories, and that consensus is totally at odds with what we're told and what we see in public life in the United States. It's an unbridgeable chasm. And that's what I want to look at today. How do you explain this huge chasm, this abyss, that separates what all the documentation shows, what all the scholarly literature shows, and what we're told, on the one hand, as against what we're told in the United States, and what's even permissible to say in the United States? Or, to put it somewhat differently, why is there so much controversy about a topic which, if you examine the scholarly literature, the legal literature, the human rights literature, why is there so much controversy about a topic which, if you look at the actual scholarship and documentation, there's no controversy at all? In a word, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a remarkably uncontroversial topic. And that's a peculiarity. How do you explain the passionate, the vehement disagreement that rages over a topic which, if you look at the actual scholarship and human rights documentation, is not controversial at all? That's what I want to discuss this evening. And I'm going to begin on a personal note, not because my autobiography ought to be of any interest to anyone here, but for reasons which I think will become clear at the end of my talk. I first became involved in the Israel-Palestine conflict in June 1982 at the time of Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Myself and several other Jews formed a little group called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon. The group was a disaster. I used to say it was the second biggest catastrophe after Sabra and Shatila. Nonetheless, many of us, as members of the group, we began to argue and debate all sorts of topics. And one of the topics that we argued and debated was Zionism. The question was, are you now or have you ever been a Zionist? I myself had no particular commitment either way. I hadn't studied the topic, and I don't usually make a commitment on intellectual or theoretical topics unless I've studied them fairly closely. And so for the next couple of years, since that was a common item of discussion and debate, I studied the history of Zionism and the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. Roughly midway along, I decided this was as interesting a topic as any, and I turned it into my doctoral dissertation. And in April 1984, I had just completed the research phase of my doctoral dissertation, and I was about to embark on the organizing and writing phase. For those of you who have gone through that process, you know that's one of the phases you do everything you can to avoid, and you look around for any excuse. And actually, I found a pretext to avoid that stage, but it wasn't an artificial one, it was a real one. In April 1984, I entered a bookstore called, it was Harper & Row back then, now it's called HarperCollins, and they had the publisher, and they had their own bookstore. I entered Harper & Row bookstore, and featured on the main table was this mammoth volume entitled From Time Immemorial, The Origins of the Arab-Jewish Conflict over Palestine. Needless to say, it was my area of study, so I picked it up, turned to the back, and there was a very impressive roster of blurbs for the book. It read like a who's who of American arts and letters. There was Saul Bellow, the Nobel laureate in literature. There was Elie Wiesel, the Nobel laureate for what nobody knows, but Elie Wiesel. Then there was Barbara Tuchman, the famed historian, her main book being The Guns of August. There was Lucy Dawidowich, the Holocaust historian. It was a very impressive list. And soon enough, the book garnered approximately 250 reviews in the United States, ranging from ecstasy to awe. So, for example, Martin Peretz, the publisher and editor of The New Republic, then as now, Martin Peretz wrote a review, a breathless review, in which he said, "This book, if read, will change the history of the future." Whatever that means, but it sounds portentous enough. And the truth be told, were the book accurate, it would have, as they claimed, revolutionized our understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The core thesis of the book was that Palestine had been empty on the eve of Zionist colonization. The Zionist settlers came, made the desert bloom, and then Arabs from neighboring countries surreptitiously entered Palestine. They sneaked in to take advantage of the new economic opportunities, and then they pretended to be indigenous to the land. And so we were now being told that those 4.5 million Palestinians, that was the figure back then, had individually and collectively fabricated their genealogies. Now, a lot of people in my camp, the left, dismissed the book as nonsense, as it was called back then, Zionist propaganda, and just laughed it off. I, however, was not willing to do that, because as a young man, and a student, I had very deeply held convictions about the world, where it was headed. I was absolutely certain in those convictions, and it wasn't a certainty born of faith. I thought, and I still do think, I did an awful lot of study and research before I reached those convictions. And whenever I had doubts about my convictions, and occasionally I entertained one or two doubts, there were always people in authority who I deeply respected, Harvard professors, Sorbonne professors, who, whenever I had those doubts, managed to dispel those doubts by saying my convictions were right. Now, as it happened, they were wrong. And the world has a way of sometimes just crashing in on your castles in the air, and that's what happened to me. And it was pretty devastating for me when it happened. Fortunately, it was at a young enough age that I was able to bounce back. However, I was determined after that episode in my life that I would never again make a mistake like that. Not only because I was wrong, but because it was extremely humiliating that you had these deep convictions which you dismissed anyone else's beliefs with as being in some way deficient. And it turns out that you ought not to have dismissed them. So peremptorily, I was wrong. How wrong I was, I don't know. Sometimes I think 40%, sometimes I think 50%, sometimes I think 80%. I'm still not sure. But I'm certain of the fact that there were a lot of errors in my thinking. And so when the Peters book came along, I was determined I'm not going to be made the fool of a second time. And so although everybody else said it was just propaganda, I honestly wasn't so sure. The book had 1,853 footnotes. It had a demographic study which had been ratified by the chair of population studies at the University of Chicago, a fellow named Philip Hauser, who wrote in an appendix that he checked the study. It's accurate. So that was pretty imposing, in particular since I knew nothing about demography. But I sat down because I knew authorities were wrong before, authorities can be wrong again. And I went through the book. The first thing I did was try to tackle that demographic study. And it was very dense. The prose was nearly impenetrable. And it was 3 chapters, and then at the end there were these charts, these appendices, where you had to where all the calculations were done. And I sat down with a paper, pencil, and every night I would just work at it after I came home from my job. And maybe around 4 or 5 days into it, it's around 1:30 a.m., I'm looking, I get that chill down my spine, my eyes begin to water. I realize the key number in those charts is a fake. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an error. It was quite clear from how the material was organized that the number was a fake. And it was a kind of exhilarating feeling, as my good friend, the late economist Paul Sweezy later said to me, discovering a fraud is every scholar's eureka. And this was my eureka moment. I got up from my bed and I started to pace my little studio apartment, the Raskolnikov-type setting for those of you who've been a graduate student. And I said, I did it, I did it, I did it. And of course, to use that new age language, I wanted to find somebody to share the news with. It was 1:30 in the morning, and I'm Jewish, so I called my mother. And I said, Ma, you won't believe it. I did it, I did it, I did it. And she said, I'm very happy for you, I'm very proud of you. What did you do? And obviously, there was no way I could explain what I did, except to say I figured out a fraud. And after that, I started to go through every footnote in the book, one by one by one. I went to the New York Public Library Research Branch, one of the great libraries in the world, and it turned out that every single footnote relevant to her main thesis had been in some way doctored, mangled, or falsified. The whole book was a fake, from start to finish. It didn't fit in the category of scholarship, good or bad scholarship. It didn't fit in the category of propaganda, because propaganda, if it's good propaganda, has a kernel of truth. It fell into an altogether separate category, the category we call fakes, hoaxes, frauds. That's the category we would put the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And actually, the first version of the article I wrote on Joan Peters' book was called The Protocols of Joan Peters. And I went through, as I said, the 1,800 footnotes, documented the book was a fraud. And the truth of the matter is, I was introduced as somebody who debunks. At the risk of sounding like false modesty, it's not really difficult at all. What I did with the Peters book was actually not very challenging. The book was totally preposterous. It was a ridiculous book. And it took only a matter of months for me to demonstrate that. I started in April. I had completed the manuscript by December. The challenge was not, and I want to underline it for what I'll say later, the challenge was not exposing the Peters fraud. The challenge was publicizing it, because so many institutions and individuals were now invested in that book. Those 250 reviews ranging from ecstasy to awe, that how would it look if a graduate student who had only studied the topic for 2 years was able to demonstrate that this, as Barbara Tuchman put it, a historical event in itself, that's what she called the book, that it was a complete collection of nonsense. So it took a very long time to publicize my findings. They were finally acknowledged roughly in 1986 when a former columnist for the New York Times, a fellow named Anthony Lewis, wrote a column entitled "There Were No Indians." And that was the end of Joan Peters. She presumably went into the sunset with about $1 million. Her book, by the way, was a national bestseller, went into 8 hardback printings, and I'll return to it later. It resurfaced again in February 2001, a topic I'll return to. Well, since the expose of the Peters hoax, I've devoted most of my public life to the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's not the topic I teach, but it's my political vocation. And it's now been about 20 years since the Peters episode, and 20-year periods are obviously small milestones in one's life and moments of reflection. And so when I reached that 20-year period, I had to ask myself, okay, what did you learn from all this? You've done a lot of reading on the topic at the expense of many other things which I wish I had read and studied. So what's your conclusion? And I reached the underwhelming conclusion that, in fact, the Israel-Palestine conflict is not very complicated at all. It doesn't raise any particularly complicated historical questions, political questions, moral questions, legal questions. It just doesn't. Let me just give you illustrations from the main areas which concern us. If you take the question of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's true that for a period of time there was among those studying the topic quite vehement disagreement. There was a main body of scholarship, basically the Israeli view of what happened. I won't use the word narrative, I refuse. Basically the Israeli view of what happened. And for those of you who have read, for example, Leon Uris's novel Exodus, it's basically the Exodus view of history. And that was the dominant one. And then there were a few people on the fringes who challenged the dominant view put forth by Israel and its supporters. Let's take one typical example. Let's take the question of the Palestinian refugees. When I was growing up and studying the topic, there was the dominant view that in 1948, the Palestinians were told by the neighboring Arab states, what were called the Arab radio broadcasts, they were told to leave, and that once the invading Arab armies had swept the Jews into the sea, that the Palestinians can return to their homes. That was pretty standard, the famous Arab radio broadcasts. As it happens, already in the early 1960s, it was known that that was factually not true. There were a couple of historians, one an Irishman, Erskine Childers, and the other a Palestinian, Walid Khalidi, who went back and checked the Arab radio broadcast recordings, because in 1948, during the war, the British, the Americans, were closely monitoring the region and preserved the recordings of the Arab radio broadcasts. They checked them. There was no evidence of these Arab radio broadcasts. Even though it was already well known in the 1960s among those who wanted to know, the Arab radio broadcast claim endured until roughly the late 1980s. In the late 1980s, several Israeli historians examining the Israeli archives, most notably Benny Morris of Ben Gurion University, he looked into the archives and he said, look, there's no evidence of these Arab radio broadcasts. Now, at this point, I was talking back in the 70s and 80s. At this point in time, there's pretty much a consensus, you can call it a broad consensus, among historians, that in 1948, the Palestinians were victims of, the term they use, of an ethnic cleansing. Even Benny Morris will acknowledge, even though he's now quite on the right end of the spectrum, he'll acknowledge it was an ethnic cleansing. It's not true that they agree on everything. So, for example, Benny Morris famously argued that the Palestinian refugee question was born of war, not by design. That is to say, there was a war, and as we all know, wars generate refugees. So Morris says it was an ethnic cleansing, but it wasn't premeditated. It was an account of the war. Then there are other historians who say, untrue, the Zionists intended, at least from the early 1930s, to expel, or as they called it, transfer the Arabs out of Palestine. The opportunity came in 1948, and they exploited the opportunity to systematically expel the indigenous population from the area that became Israel. It's true that there's some disagreement still, but it's within a quite narrow range. The whole Israeli claim has dropped off the spectrum. Everyone agrees it was an ethnic cleansing. There are differences on what caused it, so there are still differences, but the truth is, it seems to me, the range of difference is quite narrow. When you turn to the human rights dimension of the conflict, not the historical dimension, the human rights dimension of the conflict, what's most striking is there's not just a broad consensus, there's a consensus full stop. Israel-Palestine is among the most heavily, and my guess is the most heavily, monitored area of the world by human rights organizations. You have the international organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. You have the local organizations, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And then you have the local affiliates of international organizations, Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, and so on and so forth. Each of these organizations has its own legal staff, research staff, and field staff. Each is fiercely independent, and each turns out or churns out voluminous reports on the Israel-Palestine conflict. In preparation for the book I just completed, I would say I went through at minimum several thousand pages of human rights documentation over a 20-year period. What I found most striking, and I will say I was genuinely surprised, what I found most striking was there was no disagreement about what's happening there. Now that's unusual. First of all, for those of you who study law, you know how easy it is to turn and twist a word or a phrase in law to try to get it to mean what it doesn't mean. And many people make a profession of doing that. They're called lawyers. Number two, human rights law is a relatively new branch of law, of international law, which means it has a lot of gray areas. And number three, much of human rights documentation consists of observation. There is a demonstration. Here are the Palestinians. There is the Israeli army. Who started the melee? Did the Palestinians throw rocks? Were there any armed people among them? Were the armed people standing in front of unarmed people? Among the Israelis, did they give warning shots? Were they aiming at the feet? Or were they aiming at the torso and the head? All of that is observation. And just by virtue of, as most of you know, the Rashomon phenomenon, the great Kurosawa film about several people seeing the same incident but remembering it differently, just by virtue of the Rashomon phenomenon, you would expect that there would be differences in what's reported. But what was most striking as I went through the reports is that for a 20-year period, I found exactly one incident, one demonstration where two human rights organizations disagreed. Otherwise, everyone agreed on everything. It wasn't controversial. And that brings me now to the core of my remarks this evening, namely, if what I'm saying is true, there's a broad consensus on the history, and there's a consensus full stop on the human rights, then why is there so much contention and disagreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict? And I want to suggest that there are two kinds of disagreement on the Israel-Palestine conflict, one of which I would call legitimate disagreement, that is, where honest people can agree to disagree, and illegitimate disagreement, that is to say, fabricated. Just allow me one moment. get dehydrated when you fly too much. 1 second. Thank you.
Can we change the tape to later?